Record to the cloud. There we go. So let me start over. So this actually gets into the recording as we start this. Welcome and thank you for joining us for this session of our conversations with faculty and staff and members of our community. I had this idea for this conversation a while back and then saw a daily update story that said Professor Ricky Price was teaching a class on the pandemics, and I reached out and he graciously said, yes, but immediately after my Maymaster course ends, I will join you. And he was true to his word and is ready to go for us. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Chevy Devaney. I'm the Director of Alumni and Alumni Relations, classes of 1995, or William Smith class of 1995. We've got 2 kids here. My husband's also a Hobart grad, so I'm pretty steeped in the tradition of Hobart and William Smith. I see Olivia smiling. It's pretty bad. My mother-in-law also worked here at the colleges for quite a number of years in William Smith athletics, and my husband's aunt worked in facilities for 30 or so years. So it's a pretty deep family when we talk about Hobart William Smith. So just quickly about Professor Price and what he's going to talk with us about today. He will be talking with us about the politics of epidemics, which was also the focus, as I mentioned before, of his Maymaster course that he just finished teaching. Professor Price's work uses the history of identities, science, and institutions to better understand how power operates between our bodies and the state. He received his PhD from the New School for Social Research in New York City, and his dissertation looked at the history and contemporary politics of HIV/AIDS health policy. I think Professor Price's background also lends itself to what we're experiencing right now in our nation, right? And so for those of you in Minneapolis and other places where you're seeing the outcry around the state and the nations, he's gonna perhaps touch on that a little bit because his scholarship actually informs some of what we're experiencing. So again, you've got the memo before I even said it. Many of you are muted. We will take questions from you directly, so you can unmute your microphones when you're ready to ask a question, when Ricky's ready for that, and then mute it once you're finished. And we will take questions via chat, so feel free to use the chat to communicate. We're just gonna try and make this as open and fluid a session as possible. And I probably should have just asked Alan Coulter to do the introduction because he's got that voice, as we all know. And so maybe, Alan, you can round it up for us at the very end by giving us that send-off that so many of us are familiar with. I take that smile as a yes. All right, Ricky, it's over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Chevy, and thanks so much to everybody in Alumni and Alumnus Relations and the Office for Development for hosting this event. And thanks to you all for coming out or staying in, I guess, on this Wednesday afternoon to talk about epidemics, as if we haven't been doing that enough in the past few months, right? So as Chevy mentioned, I'm a visiting professor in political science, and my work looks at how policy created to contain and manage the HIV/AIDS epidemic has become a dominant strategy for healthcare intervention more broadly. And part of the reason for that is that there's no cure or vaccine for HIV/AIDS. It's been with us for nearly 40 years. And because of that, it's become a sort of model about managing long-term illnesses, right? Mainly through biomedical intervention, expensive daily pills, right, antiretroviral therapy, and then also preventative techniques. But specifically in my work, I look at how criminalization of both illness and how criminalization of poverty within communities who lack access to these affordable biomedical interventions creates a sort of de facto quarantine of chronic and manageable illnesses in Black and Brown communities, as well as communities of marginalized white people. And so a big part of what I'm trying to do is rethink how we've organized ourselves and our bodies and our communities together in relation to healthcare, and preparing a class that looked at the current epidemic offered a chance to do that. And so on some level, it was a bit cathartic too. I'm gonna open up my PowerPoint for today, but on a certain level, right, it was really kind of interesting to speak with students every day for 3 hours about what was going on in their lives, what was happening in the news, and then reading deeply about the history and contemporary politics of epidemics. You know, a few weeks ago, I thought I'm going to get really ahead of the game when Chevy asked me to do this. I wrote out a whole talk. I was like, okay, that's done. Put that away, teach the class, and then, you know, bada bing, we'll move into this. But of course, that talk is useless now. It was written 2 weeks ago. And so, you know, so much had happened over the course of a 3-week Maymester that this dynamic makes it really difficult to sort of study contemporary politics. Things are just changing so fast. So I tried to build that into the class a little bit. So I left room in the syllabus, and I left room each day to sort of address what was happening as it was happening. But nonetheless, I think there were a lot of moving parts in this. So what I tried to do in terms of organization of the course is I tried to organize it around these 3 sort of ideas. One being that institutional policy in response to the pandemic is one area where we can think about the politics of epidemics. Then another area where we can think about the politics of epidemics is in what are the scientific research and capabilities of a given community at a certain point in time, right? That's one of the biggest differences between what we're experiencing and what was going on in 1918, which we looked at a lot, right? And one of the biggest differences, right, is for a big chunk of that first year, they thought they were dealing with a bacteria because a lot of the other large-scale plagues had been bacterial, right? And they were dealing with a virus, which we didn't even know how to see yet. So what scientific research and capabilities do we really have at any given moment in time has a lot to do with the politics of any sort of epidemic. And then thirdly, what are the community responses to an epidemic and policy centered on epidemics? How do people respond to these sorts of things, right? So another way to think about this is that the institutional policy allows us to think about the framework for political action. The scientific research allows us to think about the limits of what is actually possible. And the community response is sort of a measure of people power or energy or, you know, the desire for sort of either immediate treatment or larger transformations like we're seeing across the country right now. So synergy between these 3 areas of political contestation sets the dynamics for what we might call a politics of epidemics that we were looking at all 3 weeks. And so within this framework, we looked at the current crisis, and we looked back throughout ancient history, all the way back to the plague of Athens at one point. And for their finals, I challenged the students to create public health communications, a public health communications project for their local communities around COVID. And 3 of the students from class have actually showed up tonight. They were kind enough after this class to share some of their work with us. So we're going to end with them. And the students here with us tonight are Hannah Bilton, Molly Dexter, and Olivia Stein, who had really excellent final projects, which I'm excited to share with you all. And so what I'm going to do for the next few minutes is I'm going to talk about some of the relationships to the Black Lives Matter protests that have been happening over the past few weeks and COVID, and then also thinking about how that might merge into what's going to happen with the upcoming elections, with the elections that are already happening, primaries in some states, and then the federal election that'll happen in the fall. And then we'll get into the student projects and end with that. So to begin, 2 weeks ago in class, we were discussing the strike of the New Orleans sanitation workers. And if you heard about them, they were working to organize strikes for the hoppers, the folks who hop on and off of the garbage trucks, right? And they were arguing for basic PPE. But amidst that, there was also some larger contestations that help us think about what has gone on in the past month, because so much has happened. But there were also essential workers at Amazon and Walmart and McDonald's and other large corporations, to even bus drivers across the country started striking. Tenants started organizing rent strikes. Indigenous communities like the Sioux tribe in South Dakota started challenging the sovereignty of their nations in relationship to state governance. In the case of South Dakota, setting up checkpoints and forcing anyone who entered their tribal lands to be checked for temperature and for the virus, right? To healthcare and essential workers arguing that we needed more PPE, right? So all of this was happening, Right. And we know that essential workers are more likely to be brown and black workers, and that the most precarious communities, those without the least access to healthcare, the least access to a social welfare net, and that it was within this context that we saw the viral videos of the last few weeks, ranging from the everyday harassment to murder. They were filtered through our social media platforms, all at the same time that states began opening up, some directly in direct contradiction of what the CDC was asking us to do. 30 million people plus lost their jobs and potentially their health insurance. And meanwhile, the stock market has gone up and down and seems to be recovering or stabilizing, or at least out of joint with what everyone else is experiencing. I drove through Geneva Sunday, and I was just kind of shocked at all the vacant businesses. I live in Naples, which is at the southern tip of Canandaigua Lake. And even in Naples, this tiny community of about, 4,000 people, shops are closing up all over the place. And so it's within this soup that we're trying to unravel the sort of politics of the moment. And we're seeing these transformations before our eyes. Now, to say that something is transformational, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily good or it's necessarily bad, right? It could be positive or it could be negative, but that depends upon the choices that we make together right now and as people organized in systems and institutions and communities. But we're most definitely at a moment where drastic changes to these long moribund systems and institutions are possible. So let's return again to the sanitation workers in New Orleans. They went on strike in early March, and when they went on strike, they were almost immediately replaced by prison labor. And even despite that, they weren't asking much. From this local report, this is a picture of D'Artagnan Dijon, and he's among the sanitation workers who were organizing in New Orleans. And as they entered the second week of their strike, they were just demanding better working conditions, daily personal protective equipment like gloves and masks, fixing the broken trucks that leak, raising wages from $10 to $15 an hour, and providing weekly hazard pay of $115. Things that seem more than reasonable, if not ethical and moral things to do in a pandemic.
And so, using prison labor an NLRB violation in a strike setting?
That could definitely work its way through the courts. It's really interesting, but there's certainly precedent, like what California does in terms of their fires. And so I think a lot of these contestations will be worked out both in terms of labor, but the broader point, I think, is that it's going to transform our relationship to labor more broadly, right? And unions will have, I think, an entirely different playing field moving forward, particularly if there's a stratification between at-home labor versus essential work, or depending on the course of the virus. But what these workers also remind us is this long history related to labor and race struggles in social movements in America. And so to hear of the New Orleans sanitation workers, you can't help but think of Martin Luther King's mountaintop speech, which he gave in April of 1968 to the Memphis sanitation workers, right? And after that speech, right, he would be assassinated. And so in direct reference to the 1968 Memphis sanitation work strikes, the New Orleans strikers used placards and references to those strikes. The I am a man, one of the most famous images from the civil rights generation. And so you see these workers organizing both by remixing history in these contemporary events. And here we see the original 1968 Memphis sanitation workers on protest. And so these placards, I am a man, right, the symbol from 1968, a year that had so many rippling effects that we still feel today, obviously. To echo that phrase speaks to dignity first, but it's also another way of saying I matter, or saying that Black lives matter. And so with this one example of these workers protesting, remixing these images of previous generations and forging a new set of social movement politics, this might lead one to be hopeful looking at the last 2 weeks, from the movement of striking labor to these vast transformations. And unfortunately, one of the things that we learned from COVID-19 is the way in which our healthcare system unmatters Black lives. And what we mean by when we say something like unmattering, we're engaging directly with the protest language. And we're thinking about, in terms of myself, an institutional scholar, what are the practices at institutions that I study, for example? I study the CDC and the NIH. What do they do? Because institutions are not simply these forces. They're actually people inside of offices making decisions about rules. And so when we think of institutions as human enterprises, we can have a different understanding of what they do. So what are the practices that create these quote unquote disparate impacts? This is the material effects of the systems of labor, health, and criminal justice on marginalized communities. And so one of the political discourses that is transforming before our eyes is deeply tied to these protests. Just as support for the movement for Black Lives has gained historic support over the last 2 weeks, the work didn't happen overnight. It took nearly a decade of sustained social movement organization, and that now in 2020, you almost have to, you must willfully look away to the evidence in front of you to argue against what Black Lives Matter is arguing for. And that their lives, Black lives, are unmattered through unequal access to affordable health care, the centrality to the front lines, that access to debt, loans, mortgage, and disproportionate rates of imprisonment. And I say disproportionate rates, and I use quotes here, because institutional policy, as I've been talking about over the past 40 years, blames individuals for social and communal problems. And so part of the change that we're seeing is the breakdown of this idea that we are our genes, right? This idea that one way to interpret the phrase, COVID affects Black neighborhoods or Black communities disproportionately to white neighborhoods or white communities. How we interpret that matters a lot in terms of our politics. If we interpret it in terms of individual or communal behavior, then we're missing the societal, the systemic, and the institutional reasons why lives are lengthened or shortened, not based on biological factors, but in relation to where you live. Are you living in a toxic neighborhood? Do you have access to health care? Are you working in a risky job without a social welfare net? And so we're using this passive formation of COVID disproportionately affects Black and brown communities or X communities, or that poverty disproportionately affects. We might use this moment to rethink and better describe our situations as a consequence of politics. And I think that is why you're seeing the difference in these protests compared to the ones that were happening in Ferguson just a few years ago, or in Orlando just a few years after that, right? And so there is a moment where, although all these things are changing, there's a groundlessness. There is a potential that seems to be more than simple reform, that we can have real justice. And I think that's something that is hopeful. But that hope also is contingent on elections. And we're going to be in uncharted water next year if we don't successfully pull off free and fair elections with all of these crises happening at the same time. It is crucial that we maintain these systems of democratic governance. I mean, and turmoil and shenanigans in terms of voter access and turnout have already been underway for years. We saw last night in Georgia the long lines, the lack of access to vote by mail, all of the situations like that. A few weeks ago in Milwaukee, similar things. And so the electoral systems before COVID were already under tremendous strain because of Supreme Court decisions like Citizens United and Shelby County versus Holder, which allowed unprecedented money into politics, and in Shelby versus Holder gutted the Voting Rights Act and the federal government's ability to regulate state elections, particularly when it comes to race. And so since these rulings, we've seen a slew of voter suppression techniques that haven't been seen since the days of poll taxes and poll quizzes, that prevent in particular communities of color from voting, but are also preventing working class people of all different communities from voting. And so the 2016 election was the first election after Shelby versus Holder, where we saw this sort of funny business really taking effect. And in 2018, we saw it repeated, particularly again with the example of Georgia and Stacey Abrams when she lost the race for governor, but she didn't concede, which was a remarkable moment in American history because of the number of voters that were purged from the rolls just before these elections. So I'm very excited to open this up and have a discussion with all of you, which I think we can talk about any of these issues in depth. And before we get into that, though, I want to pass it over to some of the students who we're always putting the burden on their generation to help us solve these problems. But one of the things that I always try to tell my students is that when we're thinking about these large, overwhelming political problems, we have to start where we're at, and we have to start in our homes, and we have to start in our communities, and we have to start in the institutions we live in. And we have to work to make those places represent the justice we want to see in the world. And so that's what I tried to challenge the students to do in this class. And so I'm going to turn it over to them a little bit. I'll keep the slideshow going, but if Hannah, Molly, and Liv want to chime in when I get to their projects, please do so. And then after that, we can open it up to a conversation. We should have plenty of time to talk about a lot. So with that, Hannah, do you want to talk about your idea of reaching school children through coloring books to help prevent the spread of young children? Also, Hannah, if you could introduce yourself, maybe tell us what year you are and your majors.
Hi, my name is Hannah Bilton. I'm a rising junior at the colleges. Sorry if you hear barking in the back. I have 2 dogs and they might start barking a little bit. Right now, I'm a double major in American political science and I'm planning to major with political science, but I'm also majoring in international relations and biology, and I have a minor in writing colleagues. And for my final project, I did coloring out coronavirus, which looked to link the educational system with normalizing CDC recommendations such as social distancing, wearing a mask, and washing your hands frequently and sanitizing. I chose to use a coloring book just so that it would be something that all ages could understand, and I wanted to distribute it through the school districts and the public school system of the nation, and just kind of make a national baseline of health precautionary measures to take for returning to normalcy, as we don't have like an actual normalcy return date, and just creating a new normal for this pandemic, but also for future pandemics or epidemics to come.
Great, thanks, Hannah. I have, she wrote out an entire coloring book in addition to do all this great analytical work. And this was my favorite of her coloring book pieces. Was if you're not familiar, I was not familiar with the Give a Moose a Muffin. That's the actual children's book that she's modeling here, but it's great. So thank you, Hannah. And then next up is Molly Dexter, who is in Saratoga Springs and wanted to do some public health communication projects that focused on the backstretch workers who work at the horse races there. So Molly, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about what you created for your final project?
Yeah, so I'm Molly. I'm Saratoga Springs. I'm a biology and critical health studies double major. The critical health studies is an individual major. So I made it myself because I was really interested in like biological health and like social determinants of health and all that stuff. So I made it, and a chemistry minor. So for my project, I looked at like the demographics of Saratoga Springs, and most people in Saratoga Springs do have access to healthcare. It's a mostly white population, upper middle class. And so over the summer though, there's the track, which is a really, really big part of Saratoga Springs. It really is a big part of the economy. It brings a lot of tourists in. And so even though there's a pandemic right now, there will be horse races this summer because it's very important to the city. And something very important for races to work is the backstretch workers, because they take care of the horses. And these people, they come from different countries. They're not US citizens. They are documented because of the current administration. The people have been a lot more careful about hiring backstretch workers, but they're not making all that much money, and what they make, they usually send back to their families. So they don't really have insurance. Access to healthcare is really, really difficult for this population. So I wanted to focus on preventing the spread of the coronavirus through this population through education. So these are 2 of my posters. On the left, it's the One Team Against COVID. All these backstretch workers, they work for different stables, but it's really important in a time like this that it is one team. We're all working together against this. And that kind of creates this sense of community. And then on the left, I decided to focus on washing your hands and covering your face. I think those are 2 really important things. And this would also be covered in an informational meeting with the backstretch workers to demonstrate proper hand washing and mask wearing, because just a lot of people don't know how to properly wear a mask and wash your hands. And I think demonstrating that in person would be really beneficial.
And then Molly, you have this other one as well.
Yeah, and then this is my third poster, focusing, I included 3 symptoms and all the different ways that these people could get help if they experience symptoms, because while I am focusing on prevention, if someone is showing symptoms, it's really important that they seek help and that they don't ignore their symptoms, because it could be really catastrophic for the whole community.
Great. Thanks, Molly. And then finally here tonight, or is it night yet? I don't even know. Here's Liv Stein, who's doing some great work about small businesses opening up, particularly in upstate New York.
Hi, I'm Olivia Stein. I'm a international relations major, and I'm a junior as well. There were a couple things that inspired me to want to send this message in this campaign. And the main one being that I don't want our nation and our world to have to return to square one in the fall and the winter months. Because in this class, we learned a lot about the high likelihood of second waves and occurring and how previous administrations have attempted to handle them. And with this pandemic in particular, how divided our political system really is has really been emphasized at both the state and federal levels. So as we're reopening, starting with New York State, which has been so severely affected, the idea would be that New York would be one of the first dominoes in this safe reopening process. And I wanted to target small businesses because New York is quite unique and underrated in how much small businesses actually stimulate our economy and development and our employment levels as well. And involving that many people would really generate a momentum throughout the state as well as hopefully parts of the nation. And by creating one design for each political party to separately accommodate both the Republican and Democratic philosophies, distributing them throughout the state's counties by billboards and their individual majority political affiliations would be very effective. And in order to do this, I studied the New York State 2016 elections results and the red and blue divisions by county. So this is for the more Republican areas. And so as the Republican ideology is more capitalistic and economically focused and profit oriented, portraying the financial risk with both humor and 2 very recognizable and traditional cartoon characters was the main aim at this design. And oh, sorry, can you flip to the next one, please?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, and this one is for more democratic areas. So as part of the democratic rule of thought is very built on the development and of the education system. With presidents like Roosevelt and Johnson and Obama, education really became the target of this campaign in particular. As you can see, it's got more of a darker and emotional tone, and it really like tugs at the heartstrings. So both of these campaigns would mainly be distributed through billboards and social media. And in the attempt of preventing a second wave, through this campaign, being very persuasive through adhering to both political ideologies was definitely the main tactic here.
Great, awesome. Thanks, Olivia. So I'm going to stop sharing the screen now. I think that's the end of what I have. But I just want to really thank the students again for showing up. This is above and beyond after they just finished their finals with me yesterday and then being asked to do this as well. So really appreciate their work. And so in a nutshell, that's more or less what we've been thinking about for the past 3 weeks. And I'd love to answer anybody's questions or anything that folks might be having. And I think the students are open for if you want to talk about their projects as well too. Yeah, how do we get copies of the Moose coloring book? I told you, Hannah, this would sell like hotcakes. I'm telling you.
I'm actually going to my town representative sometime this week or like Zooming with him to talk about my campaign.
That's great. That makes me really, really happy. One thing that was true about all 3 of these campaigns is I thought, you know, you could just start putting them out there in the world like Hannah's doing, or I've told Molly to send her stuff to BEST, which is the backstretch workers folks, and Olivia just needs to get those graphics out because they're both funny and heart-wrenching, which is great.
Would you be able to send stuff to us, all of us who had participated, just an email? It would be really neat to see them.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send it right to Chevy.
Now, we didn't take questions ahead of time because I figured that you would be generating and thinking some questions. And so if you've got them, no matter how out there they are, you think, please open your mics and ask your questions. You know, I think it's politics and pandemics are incredibly closely linked, and I'm always excited to get on these and learn a little bit more. It's like a mini class for me every single time, and I get to talk to the professors before this happens. So I have my questions back here, but I don't want to.
Go for it.
No, this is your show
Ruth,
too. Go for it, Carol.
I see Ruth's hand up. So Ruth,
Do you need alum help getting them to a publisher?
I mean,
Very good question.
Ruth, what were you going to ask?
Yes, I wanted to ask how you felt about age differences. This morning I went for a walk, and people, I'd say from maybe their 40s and up, were wearing masks and walking, and younger people were not wearing masks and running. And in most of the cases, they respected distance. I was on a trail 11 feet wide, so it's easy to do that there. Mm-hmm. But I'm just wondering if there aren't going to be conflicts as to opening up and to what extent people are going to be willing to attend stores and restaurants and hairdressers, depending on their age, because the symptoms seem to be much worse for older people.
Right. I mean, I think that is one of the most important political contestations to figure out in the next, how do we, actually a lot of students, not only Hannah, but a few of the other students from class focused on how do we convince our folks of our generation that this is important still, that you need to be using masks and social distancing and following the guidelines, right? And I think it's a very difficult particular challenge, because how do you convince people, particularly young people, to change their behavior, right? I'm sure if you've had children, that's difficult, right? And so how do you do that on a mass scale, and you do it in a way that isn't based primarily in criminalization or fining people or putting in increasing existing inequalities, right? So a lot of what we've seen in the past, like for example, in the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the adoption of safer sex tactics, right, was not mandated by the state, but it was something that the community came around, both gay and lesbian communities and Black and Latinx communities came around as a way to reduce harm and reduce risk. So how do we convince young people that it's in their interest to mitigate harm and risk for people who are not themselves, right, is an additional level of challenge. So Ruth, I wish I had a great answer for you, but I think it's something we're going to be working out for the foreseeable future. And I think states and institutions are going to be trying a lot of different things to try to either encourage or enforce social distancing. I heard one interesting thing. I don't know if it's totally true. It might have just been on the internet, but that some places were dumping a lot of manure in public parks to keep people from using them, which I think is that's one way to make pleasant places not work. Although I don't think it's the best option. There's maybe a range of ways to convince people to act in a certain way, right? And so, yeah, it's going to be difficult.
Was there much discussion of the impact of inconsistent and conflicting messaging regarding the recommendations and what should be done?
Absolutely. Yeah, yesterday I think we were all talking. There was the WHO put out the stuff about whether asymptomatic people could spread the virus or not. So we talked about that for a while. And that's a big reason why I wanted the students to focus on areas that they thought public health communications or public health efforts were failing, because that is something, at least in modern epidemics, we've seen happen over and over, where institutions aren't looking at all populations equally, right? Or they're missing things. They're not aware that it might be happening that there might be spread in populations that they're not even looking at or paying attention to. So yeah, I don't know if that helps answer your question, but I think it's definitely a part of it.
Some states have started to reopen, like the state of Florida, and they're also seeing an uptick in cases. What are the possibilities of states that are perhaps opening too soon having to close again, and what would the political ramifications be if governors and senators say, thanks for opening too soon, now close?
Right. So the immediate politics of that, there's going to be a huge economic issue, right? If we're reopening and closing again, there'll be another shock wave to broader economies. You also might start seeing tensions between different states. One of the jokes that we sort of ran with in the class was the tension happening right now between New Hampshire and Massachusetts. Right, of Massachusetts having stricter shelter-in-place laws and New Hampshire opening up sooner and not really having them, right? So I think you might start seeing temperature checks at borders, perhaps, if that's not already happening in some places. So immediate impacts, I think it'll be another pressure in the stressor cooker. I think the broader, more stressing thing that the political issue is a further degradation in the trust of political institutions, particularly institutions like the Centers for Disease Control or the National Institutes of Health or the Federal Food and Drug Administration, or a lot of the regulatory agencies that are in the Health and Human Services division of the executive branch, right? And so I think one thing we all learned when we were in the class was the number of different polio vaccines that didn't work properly, or were not tested properly, or rushed out, that ended up either giving other symptoms or actually injecting children with polio as in a prevention, right? So so thinking about rushing of vaccines, right, was definitely something we're also concerned about. But right, those mistakes, those quote unquote mistakes that institutions have made, either in rushing out a vaccine that wasn't ready, or Gerald Ford had another flu vaccine that was a flop. And those have helped lay the groundwork for the anti-vaxxer movement, right? Which I think is deeply troubling, right? So it's not that anti-vaxxers are just not rational people, right? It comes from a deeper history of not trusting those institutions. So I think that's the deeper fear that I have politically, is that we stop trusting these institutions. And I think we should all have a healthy criticism of science, of their practices, of what they're asking, what they're questioning, what they're doing, but we don't want to create the conditions for further skepticism of scientific results, right? And so I think if we don't, or if we aren't able to trust our institutions, I think that will lead to much more civil unrest and sustained issues than we're even seeing now. So that to me is in the background is the big thing. And then the everyday survival stuff will definitely be intensified if we have these spikes, and if they're regional or whatnot.
Dr. Price?
Mm-hmm.
I love the idea that this is a politics of epidemics. And I heard you very loudly say that there's, if we have a hope for social justice, it has to be started in the homes and in the communities, and evidently in the schools as well. In your classes, and on school campuses around the country, I would imagine that there's a very democratic idea among students. They're young, they're interested in seeing one team, they're interested in the health of the people in their classrooms and in their families. Among Republicans and Democrats, I would think those are the same concerns. Do you have many Republicans in your classes and on the school campus? And are there Republicans there that have a democratic ideal of social justice that is in line with the democratic ideal from your Democrats in class?
Oh, I mean, absolutely, right? we have a very strong conservative contingent of students on campus. And I think what's fun about being a political scientist, right, is what we actually do is we sort of break down these barriers between left and right and Republican and Democrat. And I think getting at some of the things, Mr. Coulter, that you're talking about, right? And so absolutely, and I think the way at it is exactly what you were talking about. And I think what really convinces the students of all stripes, and again, right, we're dealing with young people, so they're very, you know, I don't know how you were when you were 18, but when I was 18, I was still figuring a lot of stuff out. So the goal is mostly to help them think critically, right? And give them the tools to think critically so that they can develop their own political views, but to be also ethical and moral. And I think folks who are attracted to liberal arts institutions are that way regardless of their politics, right? But I do think what you said really hit on something, which was that it's about caring for your community, right? It isn't about these partisan labels, and that form of community response is really strong. So when you talk to students and they're like, oh, well, I want to come back and I'm not going to worry about social distancing or everything's going to be the same. I just want to have normalcy. And then you talk about, well, think about who makes up the community of HWS, right? How many folks there are in some of the risk zones of being of a certain age group or having comorbidities? What are the sort of things that you don't know about the other folks that you're, the unseen illnesses and disabilities that might make people. Mm-hmm. But I think it's exactly that. That's what we try to do at a liberal arts college is come at things from a sense of justice and ethics and of critical thinking. And that is my hope, getting back to what Ruth was saying of you know, trusting young people, right? I trust this generation very much. They've been through so much. And I think a lot of them, if not a majority of them, know the stakes of what's going on, at least in my interactions with them. But also I'm a professor, so I don't know if I get, you know, all sides of a student. They might just be.
But we are in a society for at least the last 15, 20 years that I remember, is very unaccepting, whether you're on the left or the right doesn't accept the left doesn't accept the right. And if you're in a group of people, and I would imagine in college more so than anywhere, if you express a view that is counter to what the majority feels, you are tempted to keep your mouth shut and not argue. Is that what you see?
I mean, sure. What I actually see more from students is being nervous about expressing ideas in public. But it has, and certainly there's what you're talking about, right? There's partisan division on campus, absolutely, right? But I think it's more, what I see my job as in a political science professor is to help students gain the language, the theories, and the tools to express their political opinions in a way that allows for conversation, right? That doesn't lead into that thing we see in the media all the time, but we don't really see in our real lives. But we see it in media all the time of, I hate you because you believe this or you know, whatever, right? But in our real lives, and that's where I think like one of the things that I turn to a lot is local politics, because right, in the city of Geneva, we've got folks who said very terrible things about each other during the city council election who are working really hard together on the amazing response that they're doing in Geneva, that the city council is doing in Geneva. So I think, and then it's our job as teachers to provide a space for students that they can say whatever they want politically, and we can understand it within the framework that you set up in the class. But I get, you know, again, we're dealing with 18-year-olds, so you get wacky stuff from the left, from the right, from the middle, from everywhere, right? Yeah. And so my job as a teacher is to sort of meld it all together and help everybody learn. But I think, yeah, I guess I'd leave it there.
I love it. I wish it was in your class.
I wish so too. It would be great.
Carol?
I'm Carol Brotman-White, 76. Please feel free to call me Carol. And can you give us some insights into why science has been politicized?
Well, there's a few ways to think about it. I saw a very funny tweet a few weeks ago that said, that was joking that climate scientists and epidemiologists should form a support group or something like that, right, for not being listened to. So I think there's bluntly political reasons that have to do with money, right? It is not in my financial benefit to believe in a certain scientific fact, so I will either hire scientists to say something else, or I will produce discourse against that fact. We saw that with the tobacco industries, right? That was sort of the model. Now, in terms of this, what we're seeing now, I'm not sure, Carol, if you're talking particularly about folks who believe it's a hoax, right? So there's a range. There's conspiracy theory.
Environmental science, but now, I mean, our health. I mean, everybody wants to be healthy.
Right.
It's beyond me.
Right. Well, I think part of it is that we live in a shared world of limited resources, and that includes scientists. So what scientists focus on and what they get to research is always going to be inherently political. And we fight over funding, we fight over the NIH every year, right? And we fight over all these sorts of things. And then there's just issues of scientific literacy, right? And investment in public education about what people understand as a fact, what people understand as the scientific method, and these sorts of things. And then there's also ideological reasons that may either be rooted in historical experiences or religious reasons, for example, of not wanting to have a vaccination, right? And so all these things.
So I have to, excuse me, Carol, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I have to disagree a little bit. I think what's gone on with climate science and the coronavirus is just a function of the overall politicization. Was pretty involved in the swine flu of the early 70s. A couple of people may remember that. The H1N1 problem of the early 80s, HIV AIDS, and even Ebola. None of those broke out on political lines, Democrat, Republican. That was really not part of a conversation at the time. And I think that at this point, everything from the hat you wear, the mask you wear, the t-shirt you wear. I mean, I also lived through the late 60s where having long hair identified you and created tensions, but I think they were not nearly as potent as the ones are today. Just one other side point is that the origins of the anti-vaxxers date back to the 1850s, and that really predates a lot of other things. The things that have come along in the 20th and 21st century to, quote, support the anti-vaccine movement are all kind of add-ons and excuses to the fundamental anti-science ethos of the anti-vaxxers that is now almost 200 years old.
I mean, the cover story in the magazine this weekend of the New York Times was talking about somebody who went to interview Barr, and they basically told him he had to take his mask off once he got into his office. Like a mask has become a weapon of, that's not money. There's some, I'm agreeing with you, Rich. There's some politics that's beyond money. It's not about tobacco and it's not about coal plants burning. There's something else going on and I don't understand it.
So if I'm hearing what we're getting more specific about, I think we're talking about the sort of cultural politics of Trump, right? That I have friends who live in Orlando, and it is very much left-right. The folks on the left wear masks and folks on the right don't, right? So that's one thing. And then in terms of the anti-vax stuff, the 2 points that I mentioned that we talked about from class were just moments where it opened up the field of space for anti-vaxxation to grow. But I think, of course, any new exogenous event or event that comes from the outside is going to be filtered through the existing political contestations, right? So, again, I'm not sure, Carol, if you're asking when did this begin or why is it like this?
Why?
But I mean,
Why
like,
is science political? Isn't that a fact?
Well, I guess from my perspective, I've never known when science wasn't political in a way, right? And so it's always, right? It's always a political endeavor because it's humans creating knowledge about other humans and whatnot. So I think I think there's a specific cultural politics that you and Dr. Wasserman are both talking about, which I think has more to do with a feeling of instability, and particularly folks on the far right, having to do with broad demographic changes that we've seen in our country, that we're continuing to see in our country, and that also have to do with continuing economic inequality, right? And so the fact that things get interpreted as in a libertarian way, like a lot of the protests in Michigan, where you had members of militia groups, right, protesting, or in my hometown of Casper, Wyoming, where you had similar folks holding rifles, right, that is much more, I think, stems from the more contemporary politics of both of you know, what we've seen happen, as I was just sort of trying to explain, the economic marginalization, and then the feeling of in part demographic demise or loss of power, or right, where all these sorts of things I think wrap into it.
So Ricky, I have a question, because I mean, given what Carol's question and what Richard said, right? So the politics of epidemics they've changed, right? This time it's different, right? Is that kind of what I'm hearing? So then what can we expect when we come out of this? Or should we expect when we come out of this?
Sure. Well, I think the hopeful thing that I was trying to get at in my talk is that we have a moment to transform these discourses and these dialogues, maybe uproot them, right? I mean, if you remember, President Obama used to always talk about this sort of particularly the Tea Party would you know, become more interested in science and in the things that he was interested in. I'm forgetting his term, that's why I'm stumbling here. But what will it look like? We won't know what it looks like. We're in the middle of a transformation. Like, what does what does a caterpillar look like as they're transforming into a butterfly, right? Or are we a dark, gross moth? Like, we're transforming. We don't know which way we're going. And if you love moths, I didn't mean to offend you. I did not at all. But so what will it look like? I think we're going to see, on the basics of it, we're going to see much more surveillance in certain, I think it will absolutely be partisan. It will depend on your governor, and it's going to depend on your mayor, and it's going to depend on your city council, what you're going to see in terms of what's going to be required. But there will be effects that we can't foresee if there's a second spike. And one of the things that all the students were, I think, said to a person in the class was, why didn't I learn about 1918 before this year? Like, why did all we remember from 1918 was what important things, World War I, suffrage, right? Why did we learn, the progressive movement, all these sorts of things that were going on, right? But why didn't we learn about the transformations of 1918, right? And so I think there's something haunting in that, in thinking about what we're going to look like in a year, what we're going to look like in 2 years, what we're going to look in 3 or 4 years. But fundamentally, I think it will not be the same, whatever it looks like. And I think we've all, at this point, realized that, right? There is no going back to December 2019, right? And so we have an opportunity then, if things are changing, to work towards something maybe more just, both in our healthcare system and our politics more broadly.
We've got about 5 minutes left in our hour, and I just want to kind of open it up to the floor for, to anyone who may have something to add to the talk today. 3 students were fantastic. They were actually a surprise. You were a surprise for me when I talked with Ricky, and I was very excited that you guys were coming on board, because I think it does show the level of depth and thought and breadth that we are engaging our students in. And so what you did, and how many weeks was this intensive? 3?
3 weeks, right?
3 weeks intensive.
3 hours a day for 15 days.
You paid attention, right? So thank you very much. But anyone who'd like to, Dr. Wassman, like you said, you've been working within and with things like this, and you're touching people every day, even right now, not really, you're using telemarketing, I know, or not telemarketing, telemedicine, sorry. But, if anyone has a touch on this topic that you'd like to share, please do so. Open your mics and do so. Yes.
I'd like to just mention the word attitudes. I'm thinking of the signs that you see near Indian reservations, that they want their freedom. The state motto in New Hampshire, be free or die, something like that. and American attitudes as about gun laws too is another example of that. That certain an American attitude that I think is common is, don't tell me what to do.
Yeah. I think you've hit on it, Ruth. And I think one thing I think with my students, right, is something we talked about a little bit over the past few weeks is, right, the Boston Tea Party, right? That was quite an act of rebellion, right? Quite an act of looting that we think about now. So I do think there is that desire for protest that is very American, right? And then sort of that distrust that is deeply built into, you know, what we do, you know, just a deep skepticism of ruling elites and institutions that has you know, a long storied history in good and bad ways.
Just for those of you who are residing in the Northeast, I'll give you a little reality check. A bumper sticker seen here in Dallas was, "My freedom is worth more than your safety."
Wow.
You know,
Good example.
wow. Well, I think that goes right to Ruth's attitude, right? It's I think we do have to lead from a place of compassion, you know, and what does that look like? And I think these conversations, even though this, I was gonna say it was cloaked in the topic of, you know, politics of epidemics, but I think really that's kind of where we're going from, right? Is how do we lead from here, from our hearts, and taking it from this sphere into our own personal lives and individual relationships with people, and we can grow from this. But I am scared.
Marianne, I think we are we're all praying now for our health, for the health of the nation, and trying to get things done that we should have gotten done a long time ago, and we'd like to do it together as one team. I think that Hannah and Molly and Olivia should try to take that talent, the talents that they have, and maybe put it to some advertisement or poster that could be put onto the internet to get more than the 30 people we have here, because the last hour was really very eye-opening, and it would be to the hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of students who could very easily Zoom in with us. I think this program was wonderful, and I thank you, Marianne, for it, and Dr. Price, fantastic. Just everybody stay safe, and we didn't bring this into the conversation most of the time, but God bless you all.
And that's why he's perfect at signing us off. Folks, thank you so very much for joining us once again. I do love you all. And to our juniors, I will be in touch because I think your PSAs can actually help us here on campus as well. So we'll touch base. Thank you, everybody. Ellen, thank you. Richard,
Chevy,
thanks for joining us from Texas and Florida and all over.
Yeah,
So,
thank you all.
Thank you
very
very
much.
Really appreciate it.
Ricky, you're awesome. Thank you. Thank you for joining our community.
Thank you for putting this on.
Not at all. Not at all.
Great job again, Chevy.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming, Dr. Wasserman. Big fan of your work. So thanks for coming.
And I'll tell you, the best part is when I called Ricky, like I said, the yes was immediate. And I just love working with our faculty and staff here. So
I didn't catch all of the names, but for the person who had the poster relating to the racetrack, Mike Rawlings is a member of the Board of Trustees, and he is in the media, a senior executive in the media section at ESPN. And I think that he would probably be really interested in hearing from you. And if you, I'm sure Chevy can connect you.
That's brilliant,
If not,
Richard.
I would be happy to do what I can. I think there's no shortage of public relations and advertising people among the alums. And I think each of the 3 projects done in less than 3 weeks is kind of remarkable, but each of them merit a conversation with someone who can help you scale it. And that's what the alumni are for.
Exactly. I will help put you guys on the, we're going to help put you on the map, at least in this way. And even if we'll do everything we can, because I think each one of those, you've got your audiences, right? And I can see that going into the Geneva City School Districts in terms of the coloring book and how kids are going to respond to that. And certainly Michael's role with ESPN can help kind of push that out. Even a story. I'm just looking to get you guys some press. We'll get you guys some press. How's that?
That'd be great. And
then I want to cut when you get successful.
What was that, Chevy? Sorry.
I want to cut when you get successful so we can put that towards the annual fund and scholarships. Okay.
See, but they all each had to come up with their own sort of strategy for getting out in this world. So Hannah has a very detailed plan about how you can print this stuff out. And Molly thought a lot about like color choices and money. And, Liv put so much work into like thinking about appealing to certain audiences. I'm just super proud of them and really, really fortunate they were in my class this semester. And so thank you three very, very much.
Absolutely. I just realized that Professor Slade is on this call, and just as a last PSA, we should have done this earlier, but there's a teach-in on Friday that Virgil, you don't want to show your face, huh? He's not going to show his face. But Ricky,
actually, I can share my screen again and show.
Okay.
I put the. So this is here.
Right. So this is a teach-in that's going to be happening on Saturday from 11 to 3 with faculty, staff, community members. The colleges are co-sponsoring this event, and both Professor Slade and Professor Price are on the docket to talk, present, and they'll be actively engaged throughout the year. So engage with us with some of these conversations. We'll get stuff out to folks, so you know what's going on, because like we talked about, it does start essentially in here, right? We start these communications, these conversations, and we export them, but it really is important, as as mentioned, to have both sides of the table, or at the table, I should say. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Everybody have a nice almost weekend.
Awesome. All right, folks, thank you so much. We will connect later at the next conversation.
Thanks again.
Ricky, thank you. And ladies, I will be in touch.
Thanks so much, Chevy.
You're welcome. Ruth, thanks again for joining us.
I loved it.
Thank you.